Good morning, everybody. I know we're running a wee bit late, so I'm going to speed through. I'm not going to take my full 30 minutes. Thanks for inviting me to do this. Second 15 minutes of this, well, second 10 minutes of this will be considerably more optimistic and can-do than the first. We will cover Barbie, Oppenheimer, Stanley Kubrick, robot film crews, rock and roll tour buses, and maybe A Clockwork Orange. But you've come to me at the right time, and I'm going to be an artist and a writer here much more than a public intellectual. The rock bottom truth is that nuclear dread in particular and existential risk in general has bubbled away inside me for as long as I can remember. And to truly banish something, you have to face it. Whether you should face it in public or not is another question. But anyway, get ready. Here goes. As I say, I confess I have been Holocaust haunted throughout my life, beginning in childhood. My father lost a friend to a sniper in Berlin as they patrolled side by side in the immediate post-war aftermath. So I think this is why my dad kept his family consistently aware of the startling cruelty and inhumanity of the Nazi regime. Dad's tools of education were mostly televisual, and when the urge took him, he was incontrovertible. Tonight, we're watching The World at War, or Holocaust, or Schindler's List. Okay. I've written down the worst scenes that I can remember from these television shows, but I'm not going to repeat them. But my 10-year-old self is watching these things and thinking, how can recognizably modern human beings do this with their trucks, with their ovens? How can this happen from people who look just as modern as I see the people in my life? It's the same lurch. I felt the same lurch when I was listening to the parliamentary testimony in the last few days of the surgeon Nizam Mahmoud. I don't know if you saw it. Mahmoud recently volunteered at a hospital in Gaza, and he reported, breaking down into tears, that after a tented area was bombed, IDF drones would come down and, quotes, pick off the children. Again, there's a shock. It's a primal shock, but it's a modern shock. How could such technical ingenuity be used so viciously? The historian Daniel Immerwahr noted a few years ago that when early post-war writers used the term Holocaust, quotes, they more often described atomic war than European genocide. As a young graduate adult in 1989, I devoured a book by Zygmunt Bauman called Modernity and the Holocaust. Bauman analysed how the depersonalisation intrinsic to modern bureaucracy had enabled the execution of Nazi horror and could do so again. But it didn't take long for me to extend Bauman's framework to Hiroshima as well as to Auschwitz. Now, the historian Immerwahr cautions against us exactly comparing the two. He says that Europe's Holocaust was the work of many millions of conscious hands. The bomb, by comparison, quotes, could be set into motion by a handful of men in only a few minutes. Equally, the European Holocaust was not inadvertent, in Immerwahr's expression. The genocide was fully intended, but nuclear annihilation could easily be accidental by means of a plane crash, system malfunction, or a miscalibrated threat. Now, I grant the professor's distinctions, but the deep melancholy induced by the nuclear age has still gripped me early and ran beneath any surface gaiety I was involved in. So as our Hue and Cry tour bus thundered joyfully through British cities of the late 80s and early 90s, I had my nose in books at the back of the bus, mostly those from the philosopher Theodor Adorno, which had me scratching my head at the human condition. Yes, even in the top of the Pops dressing room, I was bringing them in there as well. There's one line that leaps out from a book that Adorno wrote called Negative Dialectics, and he says this: no universal history leads from savagery to humanitarianism, but there is a universal history leading from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. I have to be honest, and I can only be honest in this circumstance. Despite the many joys of my life, emotional, creative, sometimes even political, the dark truth of that universal history and its end point, or its terrible new starting point, in both Auschwitz and Hiroshima has never left me. It's cast a shadow on everything. It's what I mean by the title of this piece, which was, as I agreed with the organisers, Absurd Modernity. We sleep, we wake, we start our day, we commute, we organise ourselves, we work through our task lists, we collaborate, we debate, we commute again, we consume our food and our narratives, we tend to family and friends, and we sleep again. And throughout all those hours of modern, busy living, we have been scuttling around on the lid of a massive powder keg. A nuclear weapons system which, as Annie Jacobson brilliantly shows in her recent book, Nuclear War, A Scenario, is super sensitive, triggered by the first rocket flare in the opponent's missile silo, whether that's been monitored accurately or not. Once that flash happens, we have only a few minutes left before the other side's executive leadership can decide to retaliate. And there is, as Jacobson painstakingly shows, an overwhelming pressure for them to do so. So, underneath and alongside our ostentatious, self-important bustle, the potential for utter carnage and chaos thrums only an accidental act or a malevolent intent away. In our book, Jacobson's scenario begins with a North Korean missile getting through and striking the US landmass, actuating the predicted, as we know, horrific consequences. Her scenario ends 24,000 years in the future. That's the length of time it takes for the biosphere to fully recover from our exploded, eviscerated civilization. Now, this will sound a wee bit perverse, but there is a personal comfort to be taken from recognizing the absurd modernity that the nuclear age produces. It's the comfort of the absolute realist as he or she faces the everyday burble. What? You really think this commercial trend, this dispute over the resources, this family tension actually matters? When the US has 1,770 deployed nuclear weapons ready to launch, Russia has 1,674, China 500, the UK 120. What do your short or medium-term plans and policies count for in any realm faced with this? A nuclear wintered world of mass death and ecological unsustainability is as close to us as a technical mistake or a leadership misstep. How have we slept all these nights? I have always suspected that the post-1945 prospect of human planetary self-destruction has deeply shaped our everyday responses. In particular, I think it produces a hedonism and a dissatisfaction, which I think is an understandable response to a collective life that could be so comprehensively and quickly terminated. Martin Amis asks in his essay collection, Einstein's Monsters, quote, "Is it possible never to think about nuclear weapons? The man with the cocked gun in his mouth may boast that he never thinks about the cocked gun, but he tastes it all the time." Psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton believed that nuclear awareness had exacted, quotes, "a psychic toll. All relationships are thrown into question." Lifton looked at fundamentalism and extremism and even divorce as generated by the radical futurelessness that nuclear self-annihilation implies. Now, take the Barbenheimer moment earlier this year. Do you know what I'm talking about? It may be either a judder before we tip into the abyss, or it might be signs of a deep realization. But there was a day this year when the film biography of Robert Oppenheimer, father of the atom bomb, was released alongside the Barbie movie. The talking point is obvious. You know, could the relationship between nuclear dread and the distracting compensations of consumerist bliss be made any clearer? Probably not. Yet, within, to me, that's a classic example of absurd modernity. There is a degree of subtlety. For example, if we understand patriarchy to be traditions and structures of male control, then that patriarchy could hardly be more foregrounded in both of these movies. Whether it's the blithely male managerialism and competitiveness of the scientists and soldiers in Oppenheimer, or the cartoonish machoism of the unleashed plastic Kens, that is male power just as a matter of bad attitude and fashion choices, something easily deconstructed by the Barbian forces of radiant, inventive femininity. Now, as I staggered out into the daylight, having watched both movies in one morning, I had to admit to myself that the grip of my nuclear melancholy had somewhat loosened. Barbie, undoubtedly a distracting spectacle. But the Barbie movie was also centrally concerned with creativity and development, with reframing things and increasing self-awareness. Could these faculties, I wondered since, be applied to our nuclear predicament, particularly to these crowds of haunted, self-loathing, death-driven male experts who are usually in charge of the nuclear process? Now, of course, hands up, I would be happy to leave the nuclear question to be resolved by the advent of more womanly times, as Alice Walker once put it. However, after an American election where Kamala Harris claimed that as commander-in-chief, she would ensure that America always had the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world, and with her predecessor, Hillary Clinton, imputing that her rival, Barack Obama, was a security-threatening peacenik, I'm not going to presume that female leadership is sufficient, however necessary it may be. So, my own personal inching away from the cliff edge of adult nuclear despair and towards something that could be an effective politics or movement against it has two pathways. One cosmic, more precisely cosmological, and one very close to home. The physicist Enrico Fermi was at the core of Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project. He directed the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in 1942. But in 1950, while still researching at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, Fermi noted an apparent contradiction. This was between the high probability of extraterrestrial civilizations existing in the universe, based on the universe's vast size and age, and on the other side, the lack of evidence for or contact with such civilizations. The paradox is summarized in Fermi's famous question, where is everybody? In 1966, the economist Robin Hanson proposed the concept of the Great Filter. This holds that one of the reasons we aren't in contact with many alien civilizations is that they might have blown themselves up, or choked or poisoned themselves to death, or both, before they or their machine representatives even get off the planet. The biologist E.O. Wilson might have added to this, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. It's terrifically dangerous, and it's now approaching a point of crisis overall. Now, this is an easy road to nihilism. I'm sure an emotion not unacquainted with many in the room. We preside over an Earth on which there are many ways to terminate ourselves now, of which the nuclear option is only one. Planetary warming, caused by unaccountable material externalities of a world capitalism, looks likely to tip us out of the ecological band that has supported humanity till now. Powerful computation, accessible through digital networks, doesn't just amplify the tribal and group tendencies of we mammalian humans. It may also put the capacity for biological disruption, genetic coding, in too many hands. The physicist Brian Koch is quite poignant about all this cosmism. He notes that life on Earth, ending up with conscious creatures like us, took something like a third of the whole period of the universe's existence to occur. That's a long time, Koch notes on the BBC's Breakfast Couch last year. And that indicates that microbes may be common, but things like us may be extremely rare. So, we're cosmically extremely rare, yet we may also be cosmically self-terminating. When you have such elemental information placed before you, how should you react? Now, my own reaction has surprised me, given my early Holocaust hauntedness. It induces in me a sense of cosmic responsibility, a sense that what I must do with my remaining lifespan is to create and build positive, active cultures of peace on this planet. It's these cultures, and I'm just looking at positive, creative, active cultures of peace all around this building, and I'm very, very pleased and honored to be amongst this culture. It's that culture that will hold its poise and exercise its wisdom when we reach for these godlike technologies. How do you build it? I'll come to the Scottish component about this at the end of the lecture, second half. But in any case, we must avail ourselves of the imaginative tools that currently normalize and make plausible our journeys to disaster, and instead deploy those imaginative tools in the service of better planet and cosmos-friendly visions. This may mean going to uncomfortable sources and seeing what can be wrestled from them. Donald Trump was just mentioned. Let's mention Elon Musk. He often justifies his space program as, quotes, making life multiplanetary and thus protecting the light of consciousness. Protecting it from what, Elon? Turns out that all the polarizations, the hatreds, and the inequalities that his social media platform produces is exactly what's intensified. And by intensifying our self-destructive tendencies, Musk hastens the diminution of consciousness, not its extension or its protection. Narcissistic moguls like Musk at least do us the service of bringing this cosmological responsibility into the realms of everyday discussion. But another resource for creating cultures of peace are the arts of science fiction. The greatest SF makers are involved in a mighty struggle with those trinity of conditions that E.O. Wilson talked about, the Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, godlike powers. These SF makers invent scenarios where all three of these can be improved and developed. Now, for me, wee bit of a detour, the films of Stanley Kubrick are the boldest examples of how the human imagination can battle with its own self-creative and self-destructive tendencies. Of course, Dr. Strangelove, that's Kubrick's first notable assay into absurd modernity. There's so much that could be said about it. But I only want to note here one thing. Dr. Strangelove's most notable image, which is, Major T.J. King Kong bestrides the nuclear missile as it falls on Soviet territory. That image is immediately echoed in Kubrick's following movie, 2001, A Space Oddity. Except this time, the weapon is a leg bone wielded as a tool by an ape, prompted by the famous black slab. As the bone spins in the air, there is a jump cut to a space station hanging in the starry darkness. Not an ICBM, a space station. Now, this very cut refutes that Adorno quote I said at the beginning, that we can only see a universal history going from the slingshot to the megaton bomb, and not one going from savagery to humanitarianism. Kubrick's people are astronauts. They're sharing their space station between communist and democratic nations, and they're certainly not warriors. They are disciplined scientists, curious explorers, pulled deeper into the universe by the call of the black slab. Now, I don't automatically approve of Kubrick's aesthetics. He has an obsession with capturing the relations between humans, their passions, and their technology. Maybe his deeper intent is to show our capacity for objectifying others around about us. And that intent goes to dark places. Lolita, the Shining, Eyes Wide Shut. The darkest place was 1971's A Clockwork Orange, so stylish in its presentation of playful violence that Kubrick took the movie out of circulation for decades. But counterpose that with his last movie, AI, Artificial Intelligence, which was developed by Kubrick but realized after his death by Steven Spielberg. In AI, a human society that hates its robots eventually drowns itself in a climate catastrophe. Mechas, kind of transcendental robots, return to the ruined planet, and when they're there, they gently revive a robot son and mother relationship for one precious day. Why have I detoured into Stanley Kubrick? Because I want to demonstrate the bravery of imagination and engagement required in order to start constructing a planet-aware culture of peace. Just to say, Kubrick is an anti-war filmmaker, Spartacus, Paths of Glory, Full Metal Jacket. So part of that imaginative bravery has to be a grappling with the direction, design, and applications of our radical technologies. Now, it's not as if this isn't urgent, particularly around the use of AI in battlefield situations. If we have been living on a knife edge in terms of the faulty systems and potential misreporting of our current nuclear situation, how much sharper will that edge get if ever more autonomous AIs make decisions with no humans in the loop? So again, one outcome of exercising our imaginative powers is to point towards peaceful, creative uses for radical tech. Let me give you a very concrete example. On recent music tours with Hue and Cry, on stage, I have been tracked in my musical performances by face-recognizing automatic cameras that robotically follow me around stage. It's a very, very strange experience. Now, what this makes possible is a multi-shot rendering of an often surging epiphanal moment, a full human camera cue micro-automated by 3 or 4 wee devices. It's a beautiful thing. You know, I'm even singing songs of peace as these cameras capture me. But as my brilliant brother ruefully reminded me, the basic software and hardware here is almost certainly a military technology. Its face recognition skills are for identifying potential targets in the field of battle. Now, should my brother and I reject this tech because of where it comes from, or is it our responsibility to show that swords can be turned into paintbrushes, if not quite plowshares? So I'm making something of a clarion call to artists in Scotland and well beyond to commit their talents to imagining futures and presents whereby humans make decisions about technologies that are not currently theirs to make. Now, if these artists answer the call, they'll be pushing against the grain. Our cultural speculations about the future in film, TV, games, novels, theatre, comic strips, wherever, are usually dystopian. Their scenarios for the future jab away at the negative emotional systems of the brain: fear, anger, panic, sadness. So it can be incredibly refreshing to read alternatives. There's a thing called, a website called Grist in the US, and they have an annual fiction competition called Imagine 2200. In these tales, complex humans in complex societies play out the dramas of their existence, balancing nature and super technologies as equal forces in their lives. It seems vital to me that our sensibility for the future brims with peace-positive cultures too. Terminator and his war of all against all can't just have it his own way. By the way, I noticed that this week's Booker Prize winner, Orbital by Samantha Harvey, is a tale of space-stationed astronauts contemplating the planet beneath them, and the author dedicated the book at her acceptance speech, quotes, "To all those who speak, call, and work for peace." So maybe that's a good sign. I said some minutes before that I had both a cosmic, cosmological, and a more domestic pathway to a peaceful world culture. It may not surprise a Scottish CND AGM to hear that my second way for the establishment of that is the creation of a nation-state independent for Scotland. And the subsequent exercise of democratic sovereignty in order to remove the UK's Trident nuclear missile system from Scottish territory. Now, the opening objection in the light of what you've just heard may be obvious. So, Pat, you seek a non-rivalrous global culture of peace by means of declaring your separation and establishing borders from others on the same landmass? Now, as many in this room will know, the devil of modern independence lies in the details. The current Scottish Government's aspiration is that national independence realises itself in interdependent contexts. Geo-economically in the European Union or the European Free Trade Association or area, geopolitically under NATO and within the UN, but as a nuclear missile-free power. That's the position. You can take your position within that, beyond that, counter to that. But minimally, the modern model of Scottish nation-state independence is not an autarky. It's not a dramatic shift leading to hard separation. Winnie Ewing's famous axiom, "Stop the world we want to get on," is perennially pertinent. Yet Scottish independence should involve enough sovereignty to enact a moment of non-proliferation, indeed reduction of nuclear weapons. As well as a declaration of independence, this would also be a declaration of imagination. Indeed, one of the classic modern definitions of nationalism is that it is an imagined community, in the words of Benedict Anderson. The quality of that imagination transmits to a networked world as an act of soft power upon the assertion of independence. And it would be quite the transmission. I assume most of you have heard about the plot device at the heart of Netflix's current hit series drama, The Diplomat. Have you heard of it? If not, I'll repeat it. The American Vice President identifies a Scottish nuclear base as a crucial line of defense against Russian advance into the Atlantic, monstrously assuming the missiles have a deterrent role. Extrajudicial activities have been perpetrated by the American government in order to stem the rise of a Scottish independent state. which it's assumed would resist being a nuclear target. It's nice to be so powerfully regarded at the heart of Hollywood. So it's always been a matter of pride to me that the Scottish independence movement has had at its core, as a third rail, an anti-nuclear weapons position. Annie Jacobson's book is a stark reminder of something we've always known in the movement, and which the late John Ainslie was at pains to evidence, which is the sheer unusability of nuclear weapons in any theatre of war due to their immediate and long-term destructiveness and the escalatory dynamic of any nuclear exchange. Another personal note, I used to live over in the far west, Gourock to be precise, and the regular sight of missile-laden submarines cutting their way through the beautiful Firth of Clyde on their way to Faslane again would often make my stomach lurch in that childish way. We've read all the news reports about onboard fires, software meltdowns, and near collisions with civilian craft. Scots are proximate to these means of mass destruction. We know very well what we want rid of. Now, I'm well aware that there are pragmatic perspectives on Trident from within the independence movement, for example. These bases should be leased to the UK upon attainment of independence, securing billions in payments over a decade or more, payments that can be used to build up currency reserves for the new nation. I would regard that as blood money. Yep. I take the moral global leadership demonstrated by a safe but effective disarmament and removal of nuclear weapons from Scottish soil, and I weigh that against a perpetuation of their corrosive and pervasive death rationale in a new Scotland for medium-term fiscal benefit, and I would almost certainly find the latter gaze wanting. Now, Space Cadet confession, I don't expect many to adopt my cosmological position on nuclear weapons. And let me just try and restate it passionately again. The fragility of these annihilatory systems is a crime against the universe, a universe that maybe all too rarely raises itself to consciousness and agency out of the processes of its material constitution. So we should strive not to snuff out our own possibility for civilizational development in possibly such an empty cosmos. But that striving has to start somewhere, in some polity or some self-determining place, at various levels and scales. A church or a village hall, the town or the city, the bioregion, the small nation, the large nation if it gets itself together. So to conclude, we need to experiment with creative, positive, participative, and peaceful ways of being with each other. Experiment with the transforming technologies that human ingenuity inevitably produces. Experiment with the emotional landscapes that we inherit from biological innovation, and then the ones that we invent through our cultural evolution. All this experimentation, as I say, has to start somewhere. So, the late, great Scottish Imagineer Alistair Gray once urged us, work as if you were in the early days of a better nation. The nuclear dimension prompts a little twist to that. We should also work as if we were in the early days of a better planet, seeking, at least and if we can, not an absurd but a wiser modernity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.